Hey, what up guys, Aaron Zastapa, better known as Aaron Brook the Gamer here, representing Monkey Hammer Games. In this video, we're going to take a look at the gameplay aspects of video games, from things such as the interaction model and game mechanics. Firstly, we're going to take a look at games interactions models. These are the player's models, or lack thereof. In games such as Call of Duty, the player is given a first-person view, where only the hands and weapon is visible. This is known as the avatar model. However, the avatar model will be given a storyline of his or her own, allowing for the player to grow an emotional attachment to the character. This impacts the player's decisions, as they are more likely to want to save the character as they feel obliged to. Another game that provides an avatar model is Spyro, where the player takes on the role of Spyro the Dragon. Though the game was aimed at a younger generation of players, Spyro was given an in-depth backstory, which allowed for players to attach themselves to. This causes players to feel distress when Spyro is in trouble, and gives a gratifying feeling when levels are completed. On the flip side, there are games that provide the player with a more godlike aspect, which gives the player control over the entire world rather than a singular character or set of characters. This is known as Omnipresence mode. Real-time strategy games such as Command & Conquer do a great job of exercising this mode, as the player is given the task of managing an entire battlefield rather than one single unit of soldiers. It could be argued that this takes away the emotional aspect of the video game, as no real connection can be made to a specific character. However, some would argue that it increases the emotional level, as the player invests so much time into a single battle or world. A game that includes both an avatar model and an omnipresent mode is The Sims, which offers the player the option to create their character or characters in any way imaginable. This freedom of creation allows for players to paint themselves onto their character, which allows players to build a huge emotional bond between player and character, as it's almost as if the character succeeds, the player also succeeds. This area of the game would be the avatar model. The omnipresence mode becomes apparent when the player enters building mode within the game, where the entire world will freeze and the player can terraform the world. This is the area that can be argued to take away the emotional attachment, as the player is just building on empty landscapes. On the other hand, it could also be argued to increase an emotional connection to the world, as the player is building whatever their heart desires, and are more likely to appreciate it, as it's what they wanted in the first place. Moving away from characters within the game, let's talk about the players themselves and how they're able to play games. By now, everybody should know the difference between single player and multiplayer. One is just a singular player, and the other will be composed of two or more players. The idea for single player and multiplayer is almost fully focused around genre specifics. This is only a personal conclusion, but from the modern video game, it's easily understandable. Single player games tend to have a flushed out story and have more fluent game mechanics. A game such as Tomb Raider is an excellent example of a primarily single player game, as the graphics and game mechanics were immense for a game released in 2013. On the other side of the table, we have multiplayer. A small amount of people would believe that people sitting in solidarity playing games online is an antisocial action. However, I feel that's quite far from the truth. Multiplayer games allow you to interact with people from all over the world through voice, text, and even in-game actions. Personally, I would argue that multiplayer is not genre specific, as any game could introduce a second protagonist for a second player to play. However, I would say that multiplayer plays strengths in particular genres such as first-person shooters. In games such as Counter-Strike, the idea for the game is to be a competitive FPS, which cannot be achieved by using an in-game AI. This is because the AI is too unresponsive and doesn't provide a real challenge close enough to a player. Multiplayer doesn't play so well in every game though. A game such as LEGO Batman includes multiplayer, which I would argue is the worst route to go. The game is aimed at a younger generation, and you're more likely to be paired with someone who has no idea what they're doing, and you would be better off keeping the second character following you around like a dog. Believe it or not, multiplayer has not always been the busy online experience that it is known as today. Back in the 70s, Pong brought about multiplayer gameplay by introducing an additional stick to control the second paddle. Ahead from there, multiplayer was reliant on how many controller ports a system had. My favourite example of this is the PlayStation 2, which originally had controller ports for only 2 controllers. After some time, the multi-tap was developed, which plugged into a controller port and opened up 4 extra slots for more players. Today, this is not a worry, as on some games, up to 64 players can join a game via the internet. It should be noted though that this is a relatively new concept, as only now internet connections are becoming stable to handle the traffic required to play online multiplayer games. Next on our list, we have narratives. Almost every game has a narrative, even the ones you wouldn't expect to. Candy Crush has the player climbing to the top of the mountain, and some games, such as Sonic, has the players freeing woodland critters. Some games, such as Assassin's Creed, feature a linear storyline, in which the player can play through the main story to reach the end of the game quickly. However, Assassin's Creed also offers a much larger non-linear side of the game, side missions. These missions don't affect the main storyline, but it does add extra content to the game to sate the player's need to play. The linear and non-linear go hand in hand, as some areas of the non-linear game may be inaccessible until a certain part of the linear story has been reached. It also further flushes out the game, as it gives the developers the option to give backstory to characters of a game. This helps further the emotional bond between player and character, as the player can sympathise with the character's situation. On the other hand, there are games that don't follow this rule per se. Episodic games, such as Grand Theft Auto V, will have the player complete an episode of the game, such as playing through a piece of the story as Trevor, before the player is able to further his storyline as Michael. The whole idea of an episodic game provides the player with an increased amount of achievement, as rather than having to complete the whole game, the player completes a smaller section and is rewarded somewhat equally. This also provides the player with more motivation to play the game, which is one of the main aims of a game's developer. Where there is any form of option, there's always a debate about it. In my opinion, fully linear games, which require the player to go through a set level, with no aspect of exploration, restricts gameplay, as there's no freedom given. However, games that include both a linear and non-linear aspects leave the game to a much wider amount of freedom, as the player is allowed to decide what area of the game they want to complete next. Finally, games with no arguable story, such as Minecraft, provide the player with no restriction other than their own imagination. Players are able to create their own goals and tasks, and maybe even their own storyline if that's how they enjoy playing. Every video game ever has a goals, challenges and reward system, whether the goal is to find an item or beat a certain boss. Some goals are short-term and some are long. In a game such as Skyrim, a goal of one of the quests is to recover a file. This alone would be an easy task which could be considered tedious and not enjoyed by players. This is where the challenge aspect of the game is introduced. In the dungeon, enemies were added, which would be determined by the player's level. The game also included puzzles such as dragon claw doors and pillar walls, where the player had to figure out the correct order. Combined, these challenges made pillaging countless dungeons fun and sometimes difficult. At the end of a dungeon, the player would be rewarded with a valuable reward or a word of power, which were always welcome. But the better reward would be the emotional and psychological reward the player would get after finally finishing a dungeon, which took possibly hours to complete. It's always a sigh of relief when you get to resurface once again to explore the vast lands of Skyrim. Tying into the challenge aspect of video games is difficulty. Difficulty is not just a little setting in the options menu. It's a mix of the goal and the challenge to achieve said goal. Within every video game, there has to be a balance between difficulty and playability, otherwise players are likely to quit due to the game being too easy or too difficult. To combat this, some games, such as Fallout 3, have an incremental difficulty system, which is where the game increases in difficulty as the player progresses. Within Fallout 3, the player is treated like a baby until they reach level 10, with a lower chance of higher tier enemies spawning, and when enemies do spawn, they are equipped with the weakest possible weapons. Alongside this, most games also include a player selective difficulty. This is where the player can toggle the difficulty settings such as easy, medium or hard. In Skyrim, the player selected difficulty alters the amount of damage the player receives and deals. The novice difficulty will have the player deal 2 times more damage and only receive half of the base damage. On the other end of the scale, the legendary setting makes it so players deal only 1/4 of the base damage and receive 3 times more damage from enemies. Some would argue that allowing players to change the difficulty in-game is cheating, as the player can simply change the difficulty to get by a difficult area or dungeon. I, however, feel that the permission to change the difficulty is a good idea, as it allows players such as myself to raise the difficulty if I'm finding the game too much of a walkthrough. Next, we're going to talk about player actions. Player actions are everything that the player can make the character do, from kick, punch and jump. Some games have really basic controls, such as an analog stick to look around and move, triggers to shoot, and ABXY to interact with the world. Some games, however, require much more complex controls. Games, such as the Mortal Kombat series, would have the player pressing tens of buttons in a specific order to be able to activate a unique move to a certain character. Achieving the correct button sequence was no easy task, but it sure was worth it to see you disembowel your opponent. Developers are always striding towards realism, which is why products such as the Oculus Rift were created, to put the player in the game. Though virtual reality gameplay is far from perfect, some developers did take immersion in gaming to a whole new level, or at least they tried. Microsoft introduced Kinect with the Xbox 360, which had the player act as the whole controller. However, most of the time, the camera could not detect the player, the lighting within the room was off, or it was too impractical to have, as the average Xbox gamer would play in a small confined space. In my opinion, the closest anybody has come to gaming immersion is Nintendo with the Nintendo Wii. Though it's not perfect, some aspects of the Wii are very fun. I found myself enjoying Call of Duty 5 more when I was playing on the Wii, as it involved me having to have somewhat of a decent aim in order to hit anything. However, in the years, the Wii has fallen down from its pedestal, and now sits on the shelf gathering dust. In every game, there are sets of strict rules which have to be followed throughout. Some games, such as FIFA, have predetermined perimeters. This is because football already has a set rulebook, and the game developers must follow it to the T. Some games are also bound by the rules of the physical world. Games such as Minecraft are on a world-like plane, so rules such as gravity have to apply to achieve any level of realism. However, a game set in space may have a different set of physical rules, such as little to no gravity. Rules that decide how the game plays aren't the only true rules within a video game. There are also cause and effects rules. This is where a player completes X and then Y happens. X may be the player reaching a certain area or opening a certain door, and Y would be the result, often causing enemies to spawn or a cutscene to be triggered. This is also known as sequence programming. Finally, there are rules that are specific to a game world. These rules can range from many things, such as a certain level has to be reached before a certain area can be accessed, or an item is made available. In Minecraft, my favourite rule is that enemies cannot spawn in light. This allows players to protect their many creations safely with the use of torches. Now we're moving on to the game mechanics. The game mechanics are essentially everything within the video game, from the character controls, to the rules within the game, and the functionality of the game itself. Game mechanics also cover areas such as win conditions and the scoring system within a game. The win conditions are an extremely vital part of game mechanics, as they specifically indicate what a player has to do to win the game. In games such as League of Legends, the win condition is for the enemy team to surrender or for the enemy nexus to be destroyed. Some games, such as Call of Duty, require a certain amount of points or score to be reached. This is known as the scoring system. The scoring system will track things such as the amount of score the player has, as seen in Tetris, or, in games such as Call of Duty, will track the score a player receives for kills and increases for things such as multi-kills or headshots. To create any video game, a structure must be made to ensure the game flows correctly. Coincidentally, the structure is essentially a flowchart. The chart itself may link to the narrative structure of the game, with multiple paths leading to the different endings of the game. Overall, all of the chart paths would lead back to each other in the end, with the exception of games with multiple endings such as GTA 5, where the end of the paths will differ slightly. The structure is essential during the development and programming process, as it shows the game developers what to work on first and inspire the later workings. In the end, the structure ensures continuity and consistency within the video game, as it allows developers to visually see what is happening within the game, and what does or doesn't work, and what needs changing. Finally, I'm going to discuss video game addiction. This controversial topic has been the spark of many debates within the media, with issues such as increased obesity levels and an increased population filled with lethargic people due to these horrid video games. While this is far from the truth, video games still hold an addicting aspect to them, which causes gamers to devote hundreds of hours of their lives to. Some video games will entice players with a gripping storyline, which keeps players hooked, whereas other games will have a challenging aspect which players refuse to leave until the challenge has been met. As a player with over 1,500 hours in Counter-Strike Global Offensive, I can safely say that I've had an addiction to the game, mostly influenced by the challenge of ranking up. It's a balance between challenge and reward, which I'm certain millions of other players would agree with.